Hello again. Right, are you ready to conclude this story of George's marvellous medicine? There it is. Grandma has swallowed George's potion. She thinks it's tea, but it's not. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's marvellous medicine number 4. And look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Oh, now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. Well, I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears, and whistling as it came. She'll feel better when she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. Jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old woman's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt your ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mum! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, Mrs. Cranky said. That's just right. But Grandma didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. There are the pictures to go with that. How do you feel, Mother? Cried Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant 1 minute and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a teeny stick, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end and pull, Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick. That's about that big. A moment later, she was no bigger than the size of a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then. cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone." "She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. There's a picture of George. To have the magic at the end of his fingertips for a few moments. Now it says here, surprise. It's a surprise. Bet you thought the book had finished. Well, here are some truly marvellous news. It hasn't. Turn the page for a whole load of Roald Dahl treats. Yippee! I tell you what, I'll put these on a different video on the website. Then you can have a look at what Roald Dahl got up to. Okay, take care. Hope you enjoyed that. I know I did. Bye.